In aerial combat, most aircraft that take severe damage are expected to be lost. Once critical structures fail or control systems are compromised, continued flight becomes unlikely, and recovery is rarely considered possible. Yet there are documented cases that challenge this assumption. An aircraft lost half its wing and still made it home. Stories like this are often presented as extraordinary exceptions, moments where luck alone determines survival. But that explanation does not fully account for why these aircraft remained airborne, what design factors made it possible, or how pilots managed control under such conditions. During operations over Iraq in the early 1990s, A-10 pilots were flying low-altitude missions against Iraqi armored units and air defenses. This put them directly inside defense fields of anti-aircraft artillery and surface-to-air missile systems. Unlike high-altitude strike aircraft, the A-10 had to stay low and slow to identify and engage targets, which made it extremely vulnerable. On one particular mission, an A-10 was hit by Iraqi anti-aircraft fire while attacking ground targets. The damage was severe and immediate. The aircraft lost both hydraulic systems, which are normally responsible for controlling the flight surfaces. In most aircraft, that kind of failure would mean total loss of control within seconds. The situation quickly became critical. Without hydraulics, the pilot could no longer rely on normal control inputs. The aircraft became extremely difficult to handle, and its response to inputs was delayed and unpredictable. At this point, many aircraft would be considered unrecoverable, but the A-10 had been designed for exactly this kind of scenario. The pilot switched to manual reversion mode, a backup system that allows limited control of the aircraft through cables and mechanical linkages rather than hydraulics. This system is extremely difficult to use, especially under stress. Control inputs require much more force, and the aircraft responds sluggishly, making precise maneuvering almost impossible. Despite this, the pilot stabilized the aircraft and began a long return flight. The damage was not limited to the hydraulics. Parts of the airframe had been compromised, and flight control effectiveness was reduced. The aircraft was no longer flying in a normal aerodynamic condition. It required constant correction just to maintain level flight. Navigation and landing became the next challenge. Without full control authority, lining up for a runway is significantly harder than simply keeping the aircraft in the air. The pilot had to carefully manage speed, descent rate, and alignment, all while dealing with degraded control response. Against the odds, the aircraft made it back to base. The landing itself was extremely difficult. Without hydraulic assistance, lowering the landing gear and controlling the descent required careful timing and judgment. The aircraft touched down safely, despite the level of damage that would have destroyed most other jets. However, this was not luck alone. The A-10's ability to survive this kind of damage comes directly from its design. The aircraft's redundant systems ensured that losing hydraulics did not mean total failure. The manual reversion mode provided a last resort control option. The twin-engine layout reduced the risk of complete power loss. The rugged airframe allowed it to absorb damage without structural collapse. At the same time, pilot skill played a critical role. Flying an aircraft in manual reversion is extremely demanding and requires both training and composure under pressure. In technical terms, the aircraft was not shot down in the sense of crashing, but operationally, it had taken enough damage to be considered effectively lost under normal circumstances. The fact that it continued flying, navigated back to base, and landed safely is what places it among the most famous battle damage survival stories. This is why the A-10 is often associated with the idea of an aircraft that can be hit, severely damaged, and still make it home. During World War II, the aircraft became known as All-American, and what happened to it remains one of the clearest examples of extreme battle damage survival in aviation history. The incident took place in February 1943 during a bombing mission over Tunisia. The B-17 was part of a formation sent to strike German targets in North Africa. Like most daylight bombing missions at the time, the aircraft faced heavy resistance from both anti-aircraft guns and enemy fighters. The B-17's defensive guns were designed to protect it, but formations were still vulnerable, especially when enemy fighters managed to break through. During the mission, the All-American was attacked by German fighters. In the chaos of combat, something unexpected happened. A German fighter, believed to be a Messerschmitt Bf 109, collided with the B-17 in mid-air. The impact was catastrophic. The collision tore into the rear section of the bomber. The B-17's fuselage was almost completely severed just behind the wings. The tail section, including the vertical stabilizer and horizontal control surfaces, was left barely attached to the rest of the aircraft. Photographs taken after the mission show the tail hanging at an angle, connected by what appeared to be only fragments of metal and internal structure. In most aircraft, that level of structural damage would result in immediate breakup. The tail section is critical for stability and control. Without it, maintaining straight and level flight becomes nearly impossible. The aircraft would typically enter an uncontrolled spin or simply disintegrate under aerodynamic stress, but the B-17 did not break apart. Despite the damage, the aircraft remained in the air. The pilot and crew immediately realized the severity of the situation. Control response was degraded, and the aircraft's structural integrity was uncertain. Any aggressive maneuver could have caused the tail to detach completely. At this point, the crew faced a critical decision. Bailing out was an option, but it carried significant risks. The aircraft was still over enemy territory, and abandoning it would likely result in capture. At the same time, staying with a severely damaged bomber meant trusting that it would hold together long enough to reach friendly lines. They chose to stay. The pilot carefully stabilized the aircraft, avoiding sudden movements. The B-17's design played a crucial role here. Its large wings generated enough lift to keep the aircraft airborne even in a compromised state. The multiple control surfaces and redundant systems allowed partial control to be maintained, even with structural damage affecting the tail. The return flight was slow and tense. The aircraft had to leave formation and fly alone, making it more vulnerable. Every change in airflow, every minor turbulence, posed a risk. The tail section was essentially being held in place by what remained of the internal framework and skin. At one point, the crew was ordered to bail out by another aircraft that observed the damage. From the outside, it looked impossible that the bomber could make it back, but the crew refused. They believed they still had control, however limited, and continued flying. As they approached friendly territory, the situation remained critical. Landing a heavily damaged aircraft is more dangerous than keeping it in the air. The forces involved during descent and touchdown can cause weakened structures to fail. The pilot had to manage the approach carefully, keeping the aircraft as stable as possible. Speed, angle, and descent rate had to be controlled within very narrow limits. Any sudden stress could have caused the tail to separate completely. Against all expectations, the B-17 reached its base. The landing was executed with extreme caution. As the aircraft touched down, the structural integrity held just long enough. The crew safely exited the aircraft, and only then could the full extent of the damage be properly examined. What they saw confirmed how close they had come to losing the aircraft. The tail section was barely attached. Large portions of the fuselage were missing or torn open. It was clear that the aircraft had continued flying in a condition that should not have been survivable. This incident became one of the defining examples of why the B-17 earned the name Flying Fortress. Its ability to absorb damage and remain airborne was not accidental. The aircraft was built with a strong internal structure, multiple redundancies, and the capacity to continue operating even when heavily damaged. At the same time, the outcome was not guaranteed. The crew's decision-making and the pilot's control under extreme conditions were just as important as the aircraft itself. Without careful handling, the structural damage would likely have led to failure before reaching base. The story of the All-American demonstrates what these battle damage survivors actually represent. It's not just about an aircraft being tough. It's about the interaction between design limits, structural tolerance, and human response under pressure. This is why the B-17 remains one of the most well-known examples of an aircraft that was effectively destroyed in combat, yet still managed to bring its crew home. Unlike many wartime survival accounts, this incident occurred during a training exercise rather than combat. Even so, the level of damage sustained was so severe that under normal assumptions about aerodynamics, the aircraft should not have remained in the air. The incident took place in 1983 within the Israeli Air Force. Two aircraft were participating in a dissimilar aircraft combat training exercise, simulating dogfighting conditions. One was an F-15 Eagle, designed primarily for air superiority, and the other was an A-4 Skyhawk, a smaller attack jet often used in training scenarios. During the engagement, both aircraft maneuvered aggressively at high speed and relatively close distance. In the middle of the exercise, the two jets collided mid-air. The impact was catastrophic, particularly for the F-15. The A-4 struck the F-15's wing with enough force to shear off a massive portion of it. Nearly the entire right wing was torn away. From a structural and aerodynamic standpoint, this kind of damage should result in immediate loss of lift on one side, causing the aircraft to roll uncontrollably and break apart. The A-4 pilot ejected safely. In the F-15, however, the pilot and navigator remained in the aircraft. At first, the F-15 pilot did not fully realize the extent of the damage. Fuel began leaking, and the aircraft entered an unusual flight condition, but it did not immediately tumble out of control. This is one of the most important aspects of the incident. Under normal expectations, losing that much wing area should have made controlled flight impossible. Instead, the aircraft continued flying. The reason lies in the F-15's design. Unlike many aircraft, the F-15 has a large lifting body fuselage. At high speeds, the fuselage itself generates a significant portion of the total lift. In this case, that characteristic became critical. Even with most of one wing gone, the aircraft was still able to produce enough lift to remain airborne, provided it maintained sufficient speed. The pilot reacted by increasing throttle and stabilizing the aircraft. Speed became the key factor. Flying too slowly would have resulted in loss of lift and control, so the aircraft had to remain at a relatively high velocity to stay airborne. Control was extremely difficult. With asymmetric lift and missing structure on one side, the aircraft constantly tried to roll. The pilot had to counter this using control inputs and engine thrust. effectively balancing the aircraft in a highly unstable condition. At this stage, the pilot made a critical decision. Instead of ejecting, he chose to attempt a return to base. This decision was influenced by the fact that the aircraft, while damaged, was still responding to inputs, and there was a possibility of recovery. The return flight required constant adjustment. The aircraft was no longer operating within its normal flight envelope. Every movement had to be deliberate and controlled. There was no margin for error. As the F-15 approached the airbase, the situation became even more complex. Landing an aircraft requires reducing speed, but in this case, speed was the only thing keeping the aircraft in the air. Slowing down too much risked losing lift entirely. The pilot initiated a high-speed approach, significantly faster than a normal landing profile. This was necessary to maintain enough airflow over the fuselage and remaining wing structure to keep the aircraft controllable. As the aircraft descended, the pilot prepared for a difficult landing. The landing gear was deployed, adding drag and further complicating control. The aircraft remained unstable, requiring constant correction. Touchdown occurred at a much higher speed than usual. The pilot engaged the arresting hook to catch a cable on the runway, a measure typically used to shorten landing distance. This helped bring the aircraft to a stop more quickly and reduced the risk of losing control during rollout. Only after the aircraft came to a halt did the full extent of the damage become clear. Ground crews observed that nearly the entire right wing was missing. What remained was only a small section near the fuselage. From a visual standpoint, it appeared impossible that the aircraft had flown at all, let alone completed a controlled landing. This incident fundamentally challenged assumptions about aircraft survivability. It demonstrated that under certain conditions, an aircraft could remain airborne even after losing a critical structural component, provided that other design factors compensated for the loss. At the same time, the outcome depended heavily on pilot response. Maintaining speed, controlling the aircraft under asymmetric conditions, and executing a high-risk landing required precise judgment under pressure. During the Vietnam War, aircraft survivability was tested in a way that fundamentally changed modern military aviation. The conflict introduced dense and layered air defenses, combining radar-guided surface-to-air missiles, heavy anti-aircraft artillery, and highly coordinated enemy fighter responses. For American pilots flying missions over North Vietnam, damage was not an exception. It was expected. Aircraft such as the F-4 Phantom II and the A-4 Skyhawk were designed for speed, payload, and mission flexibility, but in Vietnam, they were often pushed into environments where survivability depended on absorbing hits and continuing flight long enough to return to base. Many of the most documented cases from the war are not about aircraft that were shot down, but about aircraft that were severely damaged and still managed to return. One of the most common scenarios involved missions over heavily defended targets in North Vietnam, where aircraft would descend into anti-aircraft artillery zones during bombing or close air support runs. In these environments, pilots frequently encountered sudden bursts of fire from multiple directions. It was not unusual for aircraft to take direct hits to wings, fuel systems, or hydraulic lines during a single pass over a target. In several recorded cases involving the F-4 Phantom II, aircraft returned with extensive structural damage after being struck by anti-aircraft fire or surface-to-air missiles. Some aircraft lost portions of their wing skin or control surfaces, while others suffered severe damage to hydraulic systems, forcing pilots to rely on backup flight controls. Even when aircraft remained airborne, they often became difficult to control, requiring constant correction just to maintain stable flight. The A-4 Skyhawk, a smaller carrier-based attack aircraft, also became known for its ability to absorb punishment. There were instances where A-4s returned with large sections of fuselage torn open by flak, fuel leaks that reduced endurance, and damaged flight controls that made landing extremely challenging. Despite all this, pilots often continued their return flights over long distances, sometimes from deep inside hostile territory back to carriers offshore or air bases in South Vietnam. One of the key factors that made these survivals possible was redundancy in critical systems. Aircraft operating in Vietnam were designed with multiple hydraulic circuits, backup electrical systems, and structural tolerances that allowed limited control even after damage. However, redundancy alone does not explain survival. In many cases, aircraft were flying well beyond their intended damage limits. Pilot decision-making played a central role. After being hit, pilots had to immediately assess whether the aircraft was controllable, whether systems were failing progressively, and whether the aircraft could maintain enough lift to reach a safe landing zone. In many situations, pilots chose to stay with heavily damaged aircraft rather than eject, particularly when they believed there was a chance to recover the aircraft or when they were already within range of friendly territory. Approach and landing were often the most dangerous phases. Aircraft returning with damage frequently had compromised hydraulics, uneven drag due to missing panels, or unstable fuel distribution. This made descent and touchdown highly unpredictable. Pilots sometimes had to execute higher than normal landing speeds or rely on minimal control inputs to avoid overstressing weakened structures. There were also cases where aircraft that appeared barely flyable from the outside still retained enough aerodynamic integrity to remain stable, even when parts of the airframe were visibly damaged or missing. The fundamental lift generated by the wings and fuselage was often sufficient to maintain flight, provided speed and control were carefully managed. The Vietnam War forced a shift in how survivability was understood. It demonstrated that modern combat aircraft could no longer be designed solely to avoid being hit. They also needed to tolerate damage and remain controllable under failure conditions. This influenced later designs, including aircraft like the A-10, which prioritized survivability as a core design requirement. The stories of damaged aircraft returning from Vietnam are not isolated miracles. They are repeated examples of a consistent pattern where engineering resilience, redundant systems, and pilot skill combined to turn what should have been losses into recoveries.